"Excuse me, you can't park that car here." Franklin Leonard didn't look up from the grocery bags he was carefully lifting from his midnight blue Rolls-Royce Cullinan. The voice belonged to someone who clearly expected immediate compliance, but he'd heard that tone before, sharp with assumed authority and thinly veiled something else. "This is a private community," the woman continued, her phone already in her hand. "I'm going to need to see some identification and proof you're authorized to be here." Franklin finally straightened, turning to face the blonde woman in her perfectly pressed tennis outfit. She stood with her feet planted wide on the sidewalk of Willowbrook Estates, blocking his path to the townhouse he'd called home for the past 6 months. Her name tag read Patricia Ken, HOA board member. "Ma'am, I live here," Franklin said quietly, holding up his key fob. "Unit 247. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she glanced between Franklin, the luxury vehicle, and the modest townhouse behind him. Her finger was already swiping across her phone screen. "I'm calling the police. We've had issues with people posing as residents." What Patricia didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she dialed 911 with righteous certainty, was that the man she was reporting as a suspicious person owned every building she could see from where she stood. "Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you're watching from." Franklin had bought the entire Willowbrook development 3 months ago, but he'd kept that information private while he investigated complaints about the HOA board's discriminatory practices. The same complaints that Patricia Ken was personally named in. The same complaints that had triggered his review of the board's conduct. And in 48 hours, he was scheduled to present his findings to the Homeowners Association in a meeting that would determine the future of every board member. Patricia raised her phone to her ear, her voice carrying across the quiet afternoon air. "Yes, I need to report a suspicious person in our neighborhood. Black male, appears to be attempting to burglarize a residence." Franklin pulled out his own phone, not to argue, but to start recording. Some conversations, he'd learned, needed to be preserved. Franklin Leonard had learned patience in boardrooms where million-dollar deals hung on the ability to stay calm under pressure. 20 years of building his real estate empire from a single duplex purchase had taught him that the most dangerous moments often looked like ordinary Tuesday afternoons. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that corporate hostility never could. As Patricia spoke urgently into her phone, providing a description that somehow made unloading groceries sound like a criminal act, Franklin noticed curtains twitching in nearby windows. The afternoon dog-walking crowd had suddenly appeared, forming a loose semicircle of curious neighbors drawn by the commotion. "What's happening here?" The voice belonged to Dorothy Williams, an elderly black woman who lived 2 units down from Franklin. She approached with her small terrier in tow, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something harder as she took in the scene. Patricia lowered her phone momentarily. "Dorothy, thank goodness you're here. This man is claiming he lives in 247, but I've never seen him before. He's driving that expensive car, and you know the Hendersons who live there couldn't possibly afford." "The Hendersons moved out 4 months ago," Dorothy said quietly. Her eyes found Franklin's, and something passed between them, an understanding born of shared experience. "Franklin, are you all right?" Patricia's confidence flickered for the first time. She looked between Dorothy and Franklin, recalculating. "You know him?" "We've met," Franklin said simply. What he didn't mention was that Dorothy had been one of the first residents to file a complaint about the HOA board's selective enforcement of rules. Her detailed documentation had helped him understand the pattern of discrimination that had made Willowbrook toxic for residents of color. A police cruiser rounded the corner, moving slowly through the tree-lined street. Patricia straightened, her authority seemingly restored by the approaching backup. Finally, "Officer, I'm the one who called." 2 officers emerged from the vehicle. One older white officer whose name tag read Sullivan, and a younger Latina officer named Rodriguez. Sullivan approached Patricia while Rodriguez walked directly to Franklin. "Good afternoon, sir. We received a call about a disturbance. Could I see some identification?" Franklin reached slowly for his wallet, his movements deliberate and visible. He'd had this conversation before in different neighborhoods, wearing different clothes. The protocol was always the same. Comply completely, de-escalate, survive. "Here's my driver's license," he said, handing over the card. "And this is my key fob for the building access." Officer Rodriguez examined both items, her expression neutral but professional. "Mr. Leonard, This shows your address as 247 Willowbrook Lane, Unit B. That's correct. Patricia stepped forward, her voice rising with frustration. Officer, I'm on the HOA board. I've never seen this man before in my life. There's no way he can afford to live here, not with that car. Something doesn't add up. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the gathering crowd of neighbors had grown, phones discreetly recording the interaction. Franklin recognized some faces, people who'd smiled and waved during his morning runs, people who'd seemed genuinely welcoming. Now they watched with expressions he couldn't quite read. Officer Sullivan joined his partner. Ma'am, if his identification shows this address, and he is building access, what exactly are we investigating? Patricia's face flushed red. I know every resident in this community. I personally review all lease applications and ownership transfers. No one. She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air like smoke. Dorothy Williams stepped forward, her voice carrying decades of quiet dignity. Patricia, I think you need to be very careful about what you say next. For the first time since the confrontation began, Franklin saw uncertainty flicker across Patricia's face. She glanced around at the watching neighbors, at the officers, at Dorothy's steady gaze. The confidence that had carried her through the phone call was beginning to crack. But she'd committed too much to back down now. I stand by my call, she said, raising her chin. As an HOA board member, I have a responsibility to protect this community. If there's been some kind of mistake with the documentation. Officer Rodriguez handed Franklin back his identification. Mr. Leonard, how long have you lived here? 6 months, Franklin replied. I moved in January 15th. Patricia's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down, and Franklin watched her face drain of color. Her hands actually trembled as she read whatever was on her screen. Is everything all right, ma'am? Officer Sullivan asked. Patricia looked up from her phone, her eyes finding Franklin's face with an expression of dawning horror. Oh God, she whispered. Oh God, you're Franklin Leonard. The way she said his name made it clear that she suddenly knew exactly who he was. And from the look on her face, that knowledge wasn't bringing her any comfort. Franklin tilted his head slightly. Yes, ma'am. I believe we've established that. But Patricia was backing away now, her phone clutched to her chest like a shield. The meeting, tomorrow night. You're the developer. You're the one who bought. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The gathered neighbors looked confused by this exchange, but Franklin could see understanding starting to dawn in Dorothy's eyes. She'd helped him research the ownership records. She knew what Patricia had just realized. And from the way Patricia was staring at him now, not with the aggressive authority she'd shown 5 minutes ago, but with the dawning panic of someone who'd just discovered they'd made a catastrophic mistake, Franklin knew the real conversation was about to begin. Mrs. Ken, Franklin said quietly, maybe we should finish this conversation inside. Patricia shook her head frantically. No, this can't be. She turned to the officers. I made a mistake. There's been a misunderstanding. But Officer Rodriguez was already looking at her with new interest. Ma'am, you called in a report of suspicious activity. Are you now saying there was no suspicious activity? The question hung in the air like a trap. Patricia glanced around at the circle of neighbors, many of whom were still recording. Some were residents she'd cited for minor violations. Grass that was a quarter-inch too tall, garbage cans brought in 20 minutes late, unauthorized planters on their stoops. Patricia started, then stopped. She looked at Franklin again, and he could see her mental calculation. Admit she'd racially profiled a neighbor, or double down on a story that was rapidly falling apart. Franklin made the decision for her. Officers, I appreciate your response time, but as you can see, this was indeed a misunderstanding. He paused, meeting Patricia's eyes directly. Mrs. Ken was just being vigilant about community safety. I'm sure she meant no harm. The grace in his words only seemed to make Patricia's panic worse. She knew what he was doing, giving her an out she didn't deserve, demonstrating the very character she'd assumed he lacked. Officer Sullivan nodded slowly. All right, if there's no complaint from either party. Actually, Dorothy Williams spoke up, her voice carrying a new edge. I think there might be something else to discuss. She pulled out her own phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a long message thread. Patricia, you said you personally review all lease applications and ownership transfers. Yes, that's part of my duties. Then you should have seen the paperwork when Franklin bought his unit 6 months ago. Dorothy's fingers stopped scrolling. Right here, January 15th. Transfer of ownership from Henderson to Leonard. Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound. Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger. And you should have definitely seen the paperwork filed 3 months ago when Willowbrook Development LLC purchased the entire property complex. She looked up from her phone. Paperwork that lists Franklin Leonard as the principal owner. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the officers exchanged glances, suddenly understanding they'd walked into something much more complicated than a simple trespassing call. Franklin watched Patricia's face cycle through emotions: denial, anger, bargaining, and finally a desperate kind of calculation. He'd seen that look before in business negotiations when someone realized they'd overplayed their hand catastrophically. "Mrs. Ken," Officer Rodriguez said carefully, "is it possible you weren't aware of recent ownership changes in your community?" Patricia's laugh came out as a high, strangled sound. "Aware? Aye." She stopped, staring at Franklin. "You've been investigating us." It wasn't a question. Franklin nodded slowly. "The new ownership conducted a review of community management practices, yes." "The complaints," Patricia whispered. "The discrimination complaints filed with the HOA board. You've been collecting evidence." Another nod. Patricia's phone rang, making everyone jump. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "It's the HOA board president," she said, almost to herself. She answered on speaker, her hands shaking. "Hello, Janet? Patricia, where are you? I just got the most disturbing call from a resident who says you're having some kind of confrontation with our new property owner. Please tell me this isn't about the Leonard situation." Patricia's eyes found Franklin's face. "The Leonard situation? Our emergency board meeting tomorrow night. About Franklin Leonard's acquisition of the property and his review of our practices. Patricia, please tell me you haven't done anything to make this worse than it already is." The phone slipped from Patricia's hand, clattering on the sidewalk. Around them, the gathered neighbors were looking at each other with growing understanding and concern. These were people who lived under the HOA board's authority, people who'd been subject to Patricia's enforcement actions. And they were all realizing at the same moment that the man Patricia had just called the police on wasn't just a neighbor. He was about to become their landlord. Franklin bent down and picked up Patricia's phone. Janet's voice was still coming through the speaker. "Patricia? Patricia, are you there?" He handed the phone back to her with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. "I think you should take this call privately," he said. Patricia stared at him, and Franklin saw something break behind her eyes. The authority, the certainty, the righteous indignation, all of it crumbled into the recognition of just how completely she'd destroyed her own position. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Franklin nodded. "I know." But as Patricia walked away to explain her actions to the board president, and as the officers finished their report, and as the neighbors slowly dispersed with plenty to discuss over dinner, Franklin understood that this afternoon had changed everything. Tomorrow night's HOA meeting was supposed to be about reviewing the board's practices and implementing new policies. Now it was going to be about much more than that. Now it was going to be about what happens when power structures built on assumption and prejudice meet consequences they never saw coming. 24 hours later, Franklin stood in his kitchen, reviewing the thick folder of documentation he'd compiled over the past 3 months. Each page told a story of selective enforcement, discriminatory practices, and what appeared to be deliberate harassment of minority residents in Willowbrook Estates. The incident with Patricia had been the catalyst he'd been waiting for. His phone buzzed with another text from his business partner, Elena Rodriguez, no relation to the police officer. Media picking up the story. Video went viral. Board meeting tonight is going to be a circus. Franklin wasn't surprised. Cell phone footage of Patricia calling police on a black man for existing while wealthy had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. The hashtag #WillowbrookWhatNow was trending locally, and news vans had been circling the community since dawn. But the media attention was the least of his concerns. What worried him were the 3 resignation letters that had been submitted to the HOA board in the past 18 hours. Board members jumping ship before tonight's meeting, trying to distance themselves from Patricia's actions. The problem was, Patricia wasn't the only one involved in the discriminatory practices he'd documented. She was just the one who'd been caught on camera. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Through the peephole, he saw Dorothy Williams holding a covered dish, but her expression was troubled. "I brought you some lunch," she said when he opened the door. "But we need to talk." Franklin stepped aside to let her in. Dorothy set the dish on his counter and turned to face him, her usual warm demeanor replaced by something more urgent. Franklin, I appreciate what you're doing. Lord knows this community needed someone to stand up to that board. But I'm worried about tonight. Worried how? Dorothy pulled out her phone and showed him a group text thread. The remaining board members have been coordinating all morning. They're planning to paint yesterday as an isolated incident, Patricia going rogue. They want to offer you some kind of settlement to make this go away quietly. Franklin studied the messages. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Sacrifice Patricia as a scapegoat, offer Franklin a financial incentive to avoid public confrontation, and hope the media attention died down. There's something else, Dorothy continued. Janet Parker, the board president, has been calling residents all morning. She's telling people that if you pursue this investigation, property values will plummet. That you're planning to convert the community to low-income housing. The accusation hung in the air between them. Franklin had heard variations of this narrative before. The idea that holding people accountable for discrimination would somehow damage the community more than the discrimination itself. She's scared, Franklin said quietly. They all are. But scared people make dangerous decisions. Dorothy moved to his window, looking out at the community they both called home. Half the residents are furious about what Patricia did. The other half are terrified about what comes next. And tonight, you're walking into a room full of people who see you as either their savior or their destroyer. Franklin joined her at the window. Across the street, he could see news crews setting up equipment. Neighbors were gathering in small clusters, their body language tense with anticipation. The community looked like a place bracing for impact. Dorothy, can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you ever run for the HOA board? You've lived here longer than anyone. You know every family, every issue. Why let people like Patricia have all the power? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Because I learned a long time ago that sometimes it's safer to be invisible than to be a target. She turned to meet his eyes. But yesterday, watching you handle that situation with such grace while that woman tried to destroy you, it reminded me that invisible isn't always safe either. Franklin's phone rang. The caller ID showed Janet Parker, HOA board president. Mr. Leonard. Janet's voice was carefully modulated, professional. I hope you're willing to discuss this situation like reasonable adults. What happened yesterday was unfortunate, but I think we can find a solution that works for everyone. I'm listening. The board is prepared to offer you a formal apology and a substantial consideration for the distress you've experienced. Patricia Ken's resignation is already submitted. We can put this behind us without involving lawyers or media. Franklin put the phone on speaker so Dorothy could hear. What kind of consideration are we talking about? Well, given your investment in the community, we thought perhaps a waiver of all HOA fees for your unit, plus compensation for any legal expenses you may have incurred. We could arrange a private ceremony to welcome you formally to the community. Dorothy raised her eyebrows. Janet was offering him special treatment, the very thing that had created the discriminatory environment in the first place. That's generous, Franklin said carefully, but I'm not the only resident who's been affected by selective enforcement of community rules. Janet's pause was telling. I'm not sure what you mean. Mrs. Parker, I have documentation of 17 separate incidents over the past 2 years where residents of color received violation notices for infractions that were ignored when committed by white residents. I have records of architectural review applications that sat for months without response, but only for certain applicants. I have testimony from residents about verbal harassment during board meetings. The silence stretched long enough that Franklin wondered if the call had dropped. Mr. Leonard, Janet finally said, her voice tighter now. I think you're misunderstanding isolated incidents as systemic issues. Every HOA deals with personality conflicts and communication breakdowns. That doesn't constitute discrimination. Dorothy shook her head, mouthing denial. Perhaps, Franklin said. But I think tonight's meeting will be a good opportunity for the community to discuss these concerns openly. About tonight, Janet's tone shifted again, becoming almost maternal. I'm concerned about the media circus this has become. Wouldn't it be better to handle this internally? We could arrange a private meeting with the full board, address your concerns without subjecting our neighbors to public scrutiny. Franklin understood the real message. Handle this quietly, out of sight of cameras and witnesses. Mrs. Parker, transparency is important in community governance. I think our neighbors deserve to be part of these conversations. Another long pause. When Janet spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "Mr. Leonard, I hope you understand that decisions made in anger rarely lead to positive outcomes. This community has a certain character, a certain way of doing things. Sometimes change, even well-intentioned change, can be disruptive." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Franklin looked at Dorothy, who was shaking her head with a mixture of disgust and recognition. "Mrs. Parker, I'll see you at tonight's meeting." After hanging up, Dorothy sat heavily in Franklin's kitchen chair. "They're going to try to turn the community against you. Make you the problem instead of the solution." Franklin nodded. He'd expected this strategy. What he hadn't expected was how personal it would feel. The realization that some of his neighbors, people he'd exchanged friendly greetings with for months, might choose comfort over justice when forced to pick a side. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "what if they're right? What if pursuing this does more harm than good?" Dorothy looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who'd lived through decades of compromise and accommodation. "Franklin, yesterday Patricia Ken called the police on you for the crime of being black in your own neighborhood. She tried to have you arrested for carrying groceries into your own home." She stood up, smoothing down her cardigan with deliberate precision. Some things are worth disrupting. The Willowbrook Community Center had never hosted a crowd this large. Folding chairs filled every available space, news cameras lined the back wall, and residents who'd never attended an HOA meeting before stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors they'd barely spoken to in years. Franklin arrived 15 minutes early to find the parking lot already full. He walked through the crowd, noting the subtle divisions forming. Clusters of residents who avoided eye contact with certain neighbors, conversations that stopped abruptly when he passed, phones held high to capture every moment. Inside, the remaining board members sat at a table facing the audience like defendants awaiting judgment. Janet Parker looked composed but tired, flanked by two other board members who kept checking their phones with nervous energy. Patricia Ken was notably absent. Franklin found a seat in the middle section, declining the reserved for property owner, Chair Janet had pointedly indicated at the front. Dorothy Williams sat 2 rows behind him, offering a reassuring nod when their eyes met. Janet called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Before we begin tonight's discussion, I want to address the unfortunate incident that occurred yesterday afternoon." She looked directly at Franklin. "The board apologizes for any distress caused by Patricia Ken's actions. Mrs. Ken has submitted her resignation, effective immediately, and we want to assure everyone that her behavior does not reflect the values of this community or this board." Scattered applause broke out from some sections of the audience, while others remained silent. "However," Janet continued, raising her voice, "we also need to address the broader concerns that have been raised about HOA management practices." Franklin felt the energy in the room shift. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. The chance to present his documentation publicly, to let the community see the pattern of discrimination that had been hiding in plain sight. But Janet wasn't finished. "Over the past 3 months, we've been working with our legal team to review all HOA decisions and policies. And I'm pleased to announce that our independent audit found no evidence of systematic discrimination or unfair enforcement." Franklin felt his stomach drop. An independent audit? Legal team? This was the first he'd heard of any formal review. Janet smiled at the audience with practiced confidence. "In fact, our review showed that our enforcement policies have been applied consistently across all residents, with any apparent discrepancies explained by differences in violation severity, resident response times, or extenuating circumstances." She opened a folder and pulled out what appeared to be a professional report, complete with charts and graphs. "We've prepared copies of this audit for anyone who'd like to review our findings." The devastation was immediate and complete. Franklin realized with sickening clarity that the board had spent the past 3 months preparing for this moment. They'd known about his investigation all along. Dorothy leaned forward in her chair, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Janet, who conducted this independent audit?" Janet's smile flickered. "Parker Legal Associates conducted a thorough review of all board decisions and documentation." "Parker Legal Associates," Dorothy repeated slowly. "Would that be your husband's law firm, Janet?" The room erupted in murmurs. Franklin felt the ground shifting beneath him as residents processed this information. Janet's independent audit had been conducted by her own family's legal practice. But Janet wasn't backing down. "While my husband's firm did conduct the review, They maintained complete professional objectivity. The audit speaks for itself. She gestured to Franklin. Mr. Leonard, as our new property owner, perhaps you'd like to share your concerns with the community. I'm sure everyone would appreciate hearing your perspective on how we can work together moving forward. It was a trap, and Franklin knew it. Stand up and challenge the audit, and risk looking like someone who couldn't accept objective findings. Stay silent, and let the community believe his investigation had been debunked. Franklin stood slowly, aware that every phone camera in the room was focused on him. Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I appreciate the opportunity to address the community. He looked around the room, making eye contact with faces he'd come to recognize over the past 6 months. Some looked supportive, others skeptical, many uncertain. 6 months ago, I bought a home in this community because I believed it represented something valuable. Neighbors who looked out for each other, shared spaces maintained with pride, a place where families could build something lasting. His voice carried clearly through the silent room. Yesterday afternoon, one of your board members called police to report me as a suspicious person for the crime of carrying groceries from my car to my front door. But what happened yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a pattern that's been building for years. Janet started to interrupt, but Franklin continued. Mrs. Parker, I've reviewed your audit, and I appreciate the thoroughness of your husband's work. But I'd like to share some additional documentation with the community tonight. He pulled out his own folder, 3 months of meticulous research compiled into irrefutable evidence. I have copies for everyone who's interested in reviewing the complete picture. Janet's composure cracked slightly. Mr. Leonard, we've already established that there's no evidence of systematic bias. Then you won't mind if our neighbors see both reports and draw their own conclusions. Franklin began walking through the room, handing out copies of his documentation. As residents flipped through the pages, their expressions changed from polite attention to growing concern to outright anger. The first voice came from the back of the room. Janet, this shows 17 different enforcement actions against the Williams family alone, for things like excessive bird feeding and unauthorized garden decorations. I've been feeding birds on my patio for 3 years and never got so much as a warning. Another voice. Here's a citation against the Johnsons for parking their work truck on the street overnight. My contractor's truck has been parked outside my house for 6 weeks while we renovate the kitchen. And another. The Hendersons got cited for having their garbage cans visible from the street. Look at my house any Tuesday morning. My cans are right there in full view. The room began buzzing with conversations as neighbors compared their experiences, patterns emerging in real time. Franklin watched Janet's face as she realized that her husband's careful audit hadn't accounted for one crucial factor: the residents' own memories. Dorothy Williams stood up, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. Janet, I've lived in this community for 8 years. I've served on 3 different committees, organized the Neighborhood Watch program, and volunteered for every community event we've held. And in all that time, you've never once asked me to run for the board or serve in leadership. She looked around the room. How many of you have been approached about board positions? How many of you have been encouraged to get involved in community leadership? Hands went up around the room, but Franklin noticed the pattern immediately. Every raised hand belonged to a white resident. That, Dorothy said quietly, is what systematic discrimination looks like. It's not always dramatic. It's not always obvious. It's just a steady, consistent pattern of who gets included and who gets managed. Janet Parker stood up from the board table, her professional composure finally cracking completely. This is exactly what I was afraid of, she said, her voice rising. You're tearing this community apart over isolated incidents and misunderstandings. We had a good thing here before. Before what? Franklin asked quietly. Before I moved in? Before yesterday's incident got recorded? Before the community started asking questions? Janet looked at him with undisguised frustration. Before we turned every neighborhood disagreement into a federal civil rights case. The words hung in the air like a confession. Franklin felt the weight of every eye in the room. This was the moment he'd been building toward. The chance to show this community what they could become if they chose courage over comfort. But Janet Parker had just shown him something else. How quickly progress could be undermined by people who saw accountability as an attack on their way of life. The real fight, Franklin realized, wasn't going to be about changing policies or reviewing documentation. It was going to be about changing hearts. And that was going to be much harder than he'd anticipated. The meeting erupted into chaos after Janet's words. Residents turned to argue with neighbors, voices rising as months of buried tensions surfaced all at once. Franklin watched his carefully planned presentation dissolve into something resembling a town hall riot. Order! Janet banged her gavel repeatedly. We need to maintain order. But order was the last thing anyone seemed interested in maintaining. 3 different conversations were happening simultaneously. Residents comparing enforcement experiences, others defending the board's record, and a growing group demanding Janet's resignation. Franklin found himself in the eye of the storm, approached by residents with stories, concerns, and demands he felt unprepared to address. He'd planned to present evidence and recommendations. Instead, he was being asked to solve decades of community dysfunction in real time. Mr. Leonard, an elderly white man named Robert Ken, Patricia's husband, Franklin realized, approached with barely contained anger. My wife was trying to protect this community. She's been on that board for 6 years, volunteered countless hours, and now she's being crucified for one mistake. Before Franklin could respond, another voice cut through the conversation. One mistake. Dorothy Williams had emerged from the crowd, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by steel. Robert, your wife has cited my family 14 times in 2 years. 14 times for violations that white families commit daily without consequence. Robert's face reddened. That's not. Patricia doesn't see color. She enforces rules fairly for everyone. Then explain this. Dorothy held up a photograph on her phone. This was taken last Tuesday. 5 garbage cans visible from the street on Maple Drive. All belonging to white families. Not one citation issued. She swiped to another photo. This was taken the same day. My grandson's bicycle on my front porch. Cited within 6 hours for unsightly storage of recreational equipment. The photos circulated through the crowd on various phones, and Franklin watched the community's understanding shift in real time. Abstract concepts of discrimination were becoming concrete examples of daily life. But instead of unity, the revelations were creating deeper divisions. Some residents looked horrified at the documentation Dorothy and others were sharing. Others seemed to retreat into defensive justifications. Maybe there were complaints about specific properties, suggested Margaret Fuller, a board supporter. Maybe enforcement was based on neighbor reports, not board bias. Then who was reporting on the minority families? Dorothy asked pointedly. Because I can tell you, none of us were calling in complaints about each other. The uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. Franklin realized the meeting was spiraling beyond his ability to control. What he'd intended as an educational presentation was becoming a public reckoning with years of buried resentment and denial. His phone buzzed with a text from his business partner Elena. Live streams hitting national news. #Willowbrook Reckoning trending. Whatever happens next is going to be very public. The weight of that responsibility settled on Franklin's shoulders. Every word spoken in this room was being broadcast to audiences far beyond Willowbrook Estates. The community's pain was becoming national entertainment. Janet Parker seemed to realize this as well. I think we need to pause this meeting and reconvene when emotions aren't running so high. No. The voice belonged to a young Latino woman Franklin had seen in the community, but never met. She stood up in the back of the room, her infant daughter balanced on her hip. I'm Maria Santos. I live on Oak Street with my family. The room quieted slightly as residents turned to listen. 6 months ago, we applied to install a small playground in our backyard. Our application was rejected because the swing set didn't match community aesthetic standards. She gestured around the room. How many of your children play on swing sets that were never reviewed by the architectural committee? Hands went up slowly throughout the audience. Maria nodded grimly. Last month, we were cited for having a commercial vehicle in our driveway. The commercial vehicle was my husband's work van with magnetic signs advertising his plumbing business. She looked directly at Janet. Janet, your husband parks his law firm vehicle in your driveway every night. It has permanent lettering and a light bar on top. Franklin watched Janet's face cycle through emotions, surprise, anger, and something that might have been shame. That's different, Janet said weakly. Professional services are. Are what? Maria's voice grew stronger. More acceptable when they're provided by lawyers than plumbers? More worthy when they serve wealthy clients instead of working families? The question hung in the air like an indictment of everything the community had become. Franklin stood up, realizing the conversation needed direction before it destroyed any chance of productive resolution. I think we all need to take a step back. But before he could continue, his phone rang loudly in the silent room. The caller ID showed a number he recognized, his attorney's office. At 9 p.m. on a weekday, that couldn't be good news. Mr. Leonard. His attorney's voice was tense even through the speakerphone he accidentally activated. I just received an emergency injunction filing against your Willowbrook acquisition. The HOA board is claiming fraud in the property transfer and seeking to void your ownership rights. The room went dead silent. Franklin stared at Janet Parker, who was suddenly unable to meet his eyes. When was this filed? Franklin asked quietly. An hour ago. It's a Hail Mary legal strategy, but it'll tie up your ownership in court for months while they challenge the sale. Franklin ended the call and looked around the room at faces that reflected confusion, shock, and growing understanding. The board hadn't just prepared an audit to discredit his investigation. They'd prepared to remove him from the community entirely. Janet, Franklin said quietly, did you just try to have my home purchase legally voided while I was sitting in this meeting? Janet Parker stood up from the board table, her composure completely shattered now. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to protect property values and community interests. If your ownership was obtained under false pretenses. What false pretenses? Franklin's voice remained calm, but everyone in the room could hear the steel underneath. I purchased a unit in this community legally and at fair market value. I've paid all fees and assessments. I've followed all community rules. You didn't disclose your intention to investigate the board, Janet shot back. You moved here under false pretenses to gather evidence against us. The accusation was so absurd that several residents actually laughed. Dorothy Williams stood up slowly. Janet, are you seriously arguing that a black man needs to announce his intention to document discrimination before moving into a community? That he needs permission to notice when he's being treated unfairly? But Janet was past caring about how her words sounded. He bought this property to destroy what we've built here. To tear down our community standards and turn this place into. She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence echoed through the silent room. Franklin understood, with sudden clarity, that this was never going to be about changing policies or improving communication. This was about power, and some people would rather burn down the community than share control of it. The room was still recording. The injunction would be public record. And tomorrow morning, the entire country would wake up to the story of a community that tried to legally evict a black homeowner for documenting discrimination. Franklin looked around at the faces of his neighbors, some supportive, some hostile, many just confused and tired and ready for this to be over. I think, he said quietly, we need to decide what kind of community we want to be. But as residents filed out of the meeting in small, divided groups, Franklin wondered if that decision had already been made long before he'd ever arrived. 3 days after the disastrous community meeting, Franklin sat in his attorney's office reviewing a stack of legal documents that represented the most cynical strategy he'd ever encountered. The HOA board's injunction wasn't just challenging his property ownership. It was challenging the sale of the entire Willowbrook development to his company. If successful, the legal action would void every transaction, potentially displacing dozens of residents who had moved into the community over the past year. It's a nuclear option, his attorney David Kim explained. They're willing to destroy the legal foundation of their own community to remove you from it. Franklin studied the filing documents, noting the careful legal language that danced around the obvious racial motivation. Can they actually win this? Probably not, but they can drag it out for 2 years and bankrupt half the community in legal fees. David leaned back in his chair. The genius is that they're not just targeting you anymore. Every resident who moved in after your company purchased the development is now potentially affected. They're forcing the entire community to choose sides. Franklin's phone had been ringing constantly since news of the legal challenge broke. Residents calling to express support, others demanding he settle quietly to protect their property investments, and journalists wanting statements about what was being called the most expensive HOA dispute in state history. The story had taken on a life of its own. Civil rights organizations were offering legal support. Property law experts were debating the case on cable news. Real estate professionals were using Willowbrook as a cautionary tale about community governance gone wrong. But Franklin was thinking about simpler things, like Dorothy Williams, who'd been receiving anonymous threatening voicemails since speaking at the community meeting. Like Maria Santos, whose husband's plumbing business was suddenly losing contracts from community members who didn't want to be seen supporting the wrong side. like the elderly couple from Oak Street who'd approached him tearfully to explain that they couldn't afford to be involved in a 2-year legal battle. A knock on David's office door interrupted his thoughts. The receptionist peeked in apologetically. "Mr. Leonard, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Patricia Ken walked into the office looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her perfectly styled appearance had been replaced by rumpled clothes and exhausted eyes that reminded Franklin of someone emerging from a long illness. "Mr. Leonard, I need to talk to you." David started to object, but Franklin gestured for Patricia to sit. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Ken?" Patricia pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the desk between them. "I brought you something. Evidence that will end this legal challenge." Franklin and David exchanged glances. "What kind of evidence?" "Emails, text messages, recorded conversations." Patricia's voice was flat, emotionless. "Documentation of how the board planned this strategy. Proof that the injunction is retaliatory and based on racial bias." She opened the envelope and spread out printed screenshots of message threads between board members. Franklin scanned the documents, his anger growing as he read. "We need to find legal grounds to remove Leonard before he destroys property values. The discrimination claims are overblown, but we can't have him stirring up trouble indefinitely. Maybe we can challenge the property sale on technical grounds. Force him to fight for ownership. If we void the development purchase, we can start over with a more suitable buyer." David whistled low. "Patricia, this is exactly what we need to prove retaliatory action. Why are you giving this to us?" Patricia looked at Franklin with something that might have been regret. "Because I've been thinking about what you said, about what kind of community we want to be." She stood up, smoothing down her wrinkled cardigan. "I spent 3 years on that board believing I was protecting something valuable. But yesterday I realized I wasn't protecting anything. I was just excluding people." Franklin studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, he saw something he hadn't expected: genuine remorse. "Mrs. Ken, this documentation could expose you to legal liability. Board members who participated in retaliatory actions could face personal consequences." Patricia nodded. "I know. But Mr. Leonard, I called the police on you for carrying groceries to your own home. I think I'm already facing consequences." David was already reading through the documents, his legal mind processing the implications. "This changes everything. With this evidence, we can not only defend against the injunction but file countersuit for harassment and discriminatory practices." But Franklin was watching Patricia's face, seeing the weight of someone who'd finally understood the impact of her actions. "Mrs. Ken, if we use this evidence, it's going to be public. The board members who sent these messages will be exposed. Your neighbors will know what was said in private." "Good," Patricia said quietly. "Maybe they should know." She turned toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Leonard, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a promise. If you'll let me, I'd like to help fix what we've broken in that community." After Patricia left, David immediately began preparing a response to the injunction that would turn the board's legal strategy against them. But Franklin found himself thinking about the impossible choice he was facing. He could use Patricia's evidence to destroy the current board and establish clear legal victory. But that would also expose private communications that, while damaging, represented real people struggling with change and fear. Or he could find a way forward that focused on reconciliation rather than retribution. A path that might heal the community, but could also allow discriminatory patterns to continue. Franklin thought about Dorothy Williams, who'd lived with discrimination for years while maintaining hope for something better. About Maria Santos, who'd trusted the community meeting process only to watch it dissolve into public spectacle. About residents who'd supported him privately, but were afraid to speak publicly. "David," he said quietly, "what if we don't want to destroy them? What if we want to fix this?" David looked up from the legal documents. "Franklin, they tried to void your property ownership over a racial bias dispute. They've weaponized the legal system to exclude you from your own community. Sometimes destruction is the first step toward fixing." Franklin nodded, understanding the logic. But he also understood something else. Communities weren't built through legal victories. They were built through the harder work of helping people become better versions of themselves. The question was whether Willowbrook Estates was ready for that kind of transformation. Franklin called for an emergency community meeting 3 days before the injunction hearing was scheduled to begin. Unlike the previous meeting, this one would be held outdoors in Willowbrook's Central Park area, with no cameras or media allowed. just neighbors talking to neighbors about their shared future. He arrived an hour early to find Dorothy Williams and Maria Santos setting up folding chairs in concentric circles rather than the formal rows that had dominated previous meetings. The arrangement forced people to face each other instead of a board table, creating intimacy rather than authority. Residents began arriving as the sun set, their faces showing the stress of living in a community that had become a national news story. Franklin noticed the subtle self-segregation. Families clustering with others who shared their perspective on recent events, careful distances maintained between those who disagreed. Janet Parker arrived with the two remaining board members, their body language defensive and prepared for battle. Patricia Ken came alone, taking a seat on the periphery where she could observe without participating unless asked. When everyone had settled, Franklin stood in the center of the circle rather than behind a podium. Thank you all for coming. I know the past few weeks have been difficult for everyone. He looked around the faces surrounding him, some supportive, others skeptical, many just exhausted by months of conflict. I want to share something with you tonight. Something that might change how we think about our situation. Franklin pulled out the envelope Patricia had given him, holding it so everyone could see. 3 days ago, Mrs. Ken brought me evidence that could end the legal challenge against my property ownership immediately. Documentation that proves the injunction is retaliatory and discriminatory. Murmurs rippled through the gathering as residents processed this information. Janet Parker's face went pale. This evidence would guarantee victory in court. It would expose private communications between board members and potentially result in significant legal consequences for those involved. Franklin paused, meeting Janet's eyes directly. But I'm not going to use it. The silence that followed was complete. Even the evening birds seemed to pause their chatter. Instead, I want to propose something different. Something harder than legal victory, but more valuable than public vindication. He set the envelope on a small table Dorothy had positioned in the center of the circle. I want to propose that we choose reconciliation over retribution. Growth over punishment. Community over conquest. Janet Parker stood up abruptly. Mr. Leonard, I don't understand what you're suggesting. Franklin turned to face her fully. I'm suggesting that we work together to build the community we all want to live in, starting with honest acknowledgement of where we've failed and genuine commitment to doing better. And the legal challenge will be withdrawn, along with my countersuit for discrimination. Franklin's voice carried clearly through the still evening air. In exchange for a community-wide commitment to real change. Robert Ken, Patricia's husband, spoke from across the circle. What kind of change? Franklin had spent days thinking about this moment. New board leadership chosen through community-wide nominations rather than self-selection. Regular forums for residents to discuss concerns before they become violations. Transparent enforcement policies applied consistently to everyone. And most importantly, genuine invitation for all residents to participate in community leadership. Dorothy Williams stood up slowly. And if some people aren't ready for that kind of change? If they prefer the way things were? It was the question Franklin had been dreading. Then those people will need to decide whether they want to be part of building something better or whether they'd rather live somewhere else. The words carried the weight of ultimatum, but Franklin delivered them with the gentleness of someone offering a choice rather than issuing a threat. Maria Santos raised her hand hesitantly. Mr. Leonard, what guarantee do we have that things will actually change? What stops us from going back to old patterns once the attention dies down? Franklin smiled, recognizing the question as evidence of someone who'd experienced promises of change before. The only guarantee is what we create together. But I can tell you this, I'm not going anywhere. This is my home too, and I have just as much invested in making it work as anyone else. Janet Parker had been listening with growing agitation. Now she stood up fully, her voice carrying years of frustration. You're asking us to completely restructure how this community operates based on accusations and assumptions. What if we disagree with your assessment of our policies? Franklin nodded respectfully. Then we disagree. But Janet, we also have to acknowledge that the current system produced a situation where a board member called police on a neighbor for carrying groceries. Whether you see that as an isolated incident or a predictable outcome, we can all agree it shouldn't happen again. He gestured toward the envelope on the table. That documentation includes conversations about how to remove me from the community through legal technicalities. Not because I violated any rules or caused any problems, but because my presence made some people uncomfortable. Janet's face flushed. That's not. We were concerned about property values and community stability. I understand, Franklin said quietly. Change is uncomfortable. Accountability can feel threatening, especially when you've held authority for a long time. But Janet, what you call community stability, some of your neighbors experience as exclusion and discrimination. Patricia Ken stood up for the first time since arriving. Her voice was barely audible but carried clearly in the stillness. He's right. Every eye turned toward her. Patricia looked around the circle at faces she'd known for years, neighbors she'd cited and confronted and managed. For 3 years, I believed I was protecting this community. But Mr. Leonard is right. What I called protection was really exclusion. What I called standards were really barriers. And what I called community leadership was really— She paused, struggling with the words. It was really just control. She looked directly at Janet. Janet, those emails and text messages he has? We weren't discussing property values or community stability. We were discussing how to get rid of a black man who made us uncomfortable by existing in our space. The admission hung in the evening air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Dorothy Williams stood up, her voice carrying decades of quiet dignity. Patricia, that took courage. Patricia shook her head. No, it took shame. Courage would have been speaking up 3 years ago when this pattern started. Courage would have been questioning why certain families kept getting cited while others got ignored. Courage would have been admitting that maybe, just maybe, our enforcement wasn't as fair as we told ourselves it was. Franklin watched the community grapple with Patricia's words. Some faces showed recognition and regret. Others displayed resistance and denial. Most showed the confusion of people trying to reconcile their self-image with uncomfortable truths. So what happens now? The question came from an elderly man Franklin didn't recognize. Franklin looked around the circle one more time. Now we choose. We can continue fighting about who was right and who was wrong, or we can focus on building something better together. He gestured toward the envelope. That evidence stays sealed if we're willing to commit to real change. The legal challenges get dropped. And we start fresh with leadership that represents everyone in this community. Janet Parker sat down heavily, her authority visibly crumbling. And if we refuse? If we don't accept your terms? Franklin met her eyes with something that might have been compassion. Then we proceed with legal action, and the courts decide who gets to stay and who has to leave. But Janet, nobody wins in that scenario. The community gets destroyed either way. The choice was clear: transformation or destruction. As residents looked around at each other in the gathering darkness, Franklin realized the real revelation wasn't about discrimination or legal challenges or property rights. It was about whether a community could choose to become something better than it had been. 6 months later, Franklin stood in the same community park, but everything had changed. The Willowbrook Community Council, the new governing body elected by all residents through community-wide nominations, was hosting its monthly Coffee and Concerns Forum. Folding tables held homemade pastries contributed by various families, while children played on the playground that Maria Santos and her husband had finally been permitted to install. Dorothy Williams stood at a microphone addressing the gathered crowd in her new role as Community Council President. Before we discuss this month's maintenance priorities, I want to acknowledge the anniversary of an important moment in our community's history. She gestured toward Franklin, who was helping Patricia Ken set up a voter registration table. 6 months ago, we faced a choice between division and unity, between protecting old patterns and building new possibilities. Today, I think we can see the results of the choice we made. Franklin looked around at faces that had become genuinely familiar over the past half year. Robert Ken was organizing a neighborhood watch program that actually focused on safety rather than exclusion. Maria Santos served as the new architectural review coordinator, having streamlined approval processes while maintaining community standards. Even Janet Parker had found a role coordinating volunteer activities, channeling her organizational skills toward inclusion rather than control. The transformation hadn't been easy. 3 families had chosen to leave rather than adapt to new community norms. Several heated discussions had been required to establish enforcement policies that felt fair to everyone. And the work of building trust between neighbors who'd been divided by months of conflict was ongoing. But it was working. Franklin, Dorothy called from the microphone, would you like to share an update on the community development project? Franklin stepped forward, pulling out a folder that looked remarkably similar to the documentation he'd compiled months earlier. But this time, it contained proposals rather than complaints. The Community Council has approved our application for a community garden in the shared space behind Oak Street. We'll be breaking ground next month, with plots available to any resident who wants to participate. Applause broke out from the crowd. Franklin continued, "We've also received approval for the Neighborhood Mentorship Program, pairing longtime residents with new families to help them get connected and involved from day one." He looked around at faces that reflected genuine engagement rather than passive attendance. Most importantly, we've established the Community Equity Fund, a resource for any resident who wants to improve their property but might need assistance with architectural review fees or assessment costs. Patricia Ken raised her hand from the back of the group. In her new role as Community Outreach Coordinator, she'd been working to repair relationships damaged by years of selective enforcement. "Franklin, could you tell everyone about the regional recognition we've received?" Franklin smiled, remembering his initial hopes for what Willowbrook could become. The State Housing Authority has selected Willowbrook as a model community for inclusive governance practices. We'll be hosting visitors from other HOAs who want to learn from our transition process. What he didn't mention was the personal recognition he'd received: invitations to speak at conferences, articles in professional journals, and consulting offers from other communities facing similar challenges. None of that mattered as much as the simple fact that he could walk to his mailbox without wondering if someone would question his right to be there. As the forum concluded and residents began cleaning up, Dorothy approached Franklin with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," she said, watching families pack up folding chairs and leftover pastries. "All those months when I stayed quiet about discrimination, I told myself I was being practical, keeping my head down, avoiding confrontation." Franklin nodded, understanding the complexity of choices people made when facing exclusion. "But you showed us something different. You showed us that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is insist on being treated with dignity, even when it's uncomfortable for other people." Dorothy smiled, gesturing toward children playing together on equipment that might never have been installed under the old system. "Especially when it's uncomfortable for other people." As Franklin walked home through streets that felt genuinely welcoming for the first time since he'd moved in, his phone buzzed with a text from his business partner Elena. "New development opportunity in Riverside Heights. Similar HOA issues. Interested in consulting." Franklin paused on his front step, looking back at the community that had become home through struggle and transformation rather than simple geography. The work here was far from complete. Building inclusive community was an ongoing process, not a one-time achievement. But they'd proven something important. People could choose to be better than their worst moments. Communities could grow beyond their limiting patterns. And sometimes the most radical act was simply insisting on belonging where you had every right to be. Franklin typed back a response to Elena. "Send me the details. Sounds like they might need to hear about Willowbrook's transformation." As he unlocked his front door, Franklin thought about the sealed envelope that still sat in his safe. Evidence of discrimination that would never need to see daylight because something better had taken its place. Patricia Ken was right. Change required courage. But it also required hope. The audacious belief that people could become better versions of themselves when given the opportunity and support to grow. And as Franklin looked out at his neighborhood, where porch lights were coming on in homes where all families felt genuinely welcome, he knew that hope had been justified. The real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the simple fact that tomorrow, every resident of Willowbrook Estates could walk to their mailbox with dignity. Some transformations, Franklin reflected, were worth fighting for. What did this story teach you about the power of choosing reconciliation over retribution and the courage required to build inclusive communities? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.